Hello and welcome back to this section on security goals. Specifically in this section we are going to talk about authentication. If you remember from the last lecture on identification, in the absence of identity, candidate request for offer letter was declined initially by the recruiter. But later when Nasir identified himself to the recruiter, he was able to receive the offer letter successfully. So what I want to emphasize here is that identification is important and systems need to identify themselves definitely. But do you think that only identification is important and it can solve your problem? If I tell you my name is Gaurav, but how do you exactly know if I am Gaurav? Systems have to authenticate themselves or prove their identity, and this brings us to this lecture on authentication. Imagine what happens if there are multiple persons with malicious intent start claiming the identity Nasir. Do you think it will be easy for recruiter to go ahead and release the offer letter to any random guy identifying himself as Nasir? Definitely not. Now the recruiter is worried about how to identify real Nasir. This brings us to the problem related to authentication. And we will see how authentication is the answer to these problems. Imagine you are the service provider. How to be sure that the person or system requesting the data is the actual requester he is claiming to be, like in this case Nasir. How the recruiter will know that the Nasir who he is claiming is actual Nasir? Imagine you are the service consumer or client. Then how to be sure that the person system sending the data is the actual sender he is claiming to be? So basically how you can trust the data sent by the third party. Before you can trust the data sent by the third party, you should be able to identify and authenticate the person sending the data to you. So authentication is the process of validating an identity provided to a system. And the entire goal of authentication is to establish that the subject is genuine. So if you remember from the last lecture, when I tried to claim a random identity in the Gmail system, it asked me the password to prove my identity, and that's what the authentication is all about. So authentication is the process of proving an identity, and it occurs when subject provide appropriate credentials to prove their identity. Like we can see the login screen. I think you are watching this lecture on Udemy. So if you see Udemy asks you to log in to the portal, and that is the way Udemy is authenticating the ID that you are trying to claim in their system. That happens basically with any login portal. It asks you an identity and it asks you to prove that identity in the form of password. Let's go back to the example where the recruiter was in a dilemma how to identify. Later on the same day she read about authentication concept, and she does this. She asks all the candidate to prove their identity by asking date of birth. Only real Nasir was able to successfully identify himself by sending his correct date of birth. Genius, right? Let's move on to the type of authentication. The first type of authentication is categorized as type 1 authentication, and it is something you know, that is passwords to any login portal, PIN or passphrase. The second type of authentication is categorized as type 2 authentication, and it is something you have. You have like your ID card, your passport, the smart card and any RSA token. The third type of authentication is categorized as type 3 authentication, and it is actually something that you are, like the biometrics, where your fingerprint, your iris scan and facial geometry. So it is something that you are actually. The next category is type 4 authentication, and it deals with the system, again like IP address, MAC address. So the type 4 authentication again uniquely identifies the system. The last type of authentication we have is type 5 authentication, and it is something you do, like your signature and your pattern lock on the screen So we see that there are various kind of authentication, and this can help you to uniquely identify yourself. It can help you to prove your identity, to make your authentication strong. So to make your authentication criteria strong, you can go with the combination of one or more categories of authentication. So suppose currently you log in into the portal only using password. Now if your password gets hacked, it is very easy to claim your identity by any third party. Now you combine it with any of the type 2, type 3 or type 4 authentication, so it becomes two-factor authentication. So in this case, it's like you ask for the password and then you ask for the pattern lock when the customer log in, or you ask for the token number. So any combination of two of the categories here can give you the two-factor authentication. Now there is other criteria also, that is known as multi-factor authentication, where you combine two or more of the authentication mechanisms mentioned here. That gives multi-factor authentication. So you combine more authentication from the list mentioned here, and it becomes more strong way to protect your identity. Now what we see here is client authentication. Client authentication is used by the server when the server needs to know exactly who is accessing the information on their site. Now server identification is a kind of authentication used by the client when the client needs to know that this server is the actual system it claims to be, and it is the server you intend to connect to. We'll see later in the course that how client authentication and server authentication can help you in designing application security. We will see how SSL TLS certificates will help us to achieve one-way SSL authentication or two-way SSL authentication, that is also known as mutual authentication, in later part of the course. With this, we will wind up this lecture on authentication. I hope this was helpful to you in enhancing your concept on authentication. We'll meet in the next lecture. Thank you.